New York City, October 12, 1960. The United Nations General Assembly is in session, but what happens next is unlike anything the world of diplomacy has ever witnessed. Amidst a heated debate, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, suddenly takes off his shoe and begins hammering it on his desk. The room erupts. Following his lead, other members of the Soviet delegation start pounding their fists and stomping their feet in a thunderous, chaotic protest against speeches they deemed hostile. The session is immediately suspended. The scandal is immense. Western newspapers splash the bizarre incident across their front pages, painting a vivid picture of the wild behavior of the Soviet Union's top leadership. But in the midst of all that noise and fury, no one noticed a short, stocky man sitting quietly near Khrushchev. In fact, his name was only known within very specific diplomatic circles. He was just a face in the crowd, a footnote to a bizarre historical moment. But this man was the real story, because just 1 year later, he would become the single most important American asset inside the Soviet Union. A figure the CIA would one day call the diamond in their crown. And Khrushchev's shoe, it played a surprisingly important part in his incredible 2-decade story. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. He would work for the Americans for nearly 20 years, and his story reveals a hidden truth sometimes. The loudest moments in history are just a distraction. As soon as a key operative leaves a country, their entire network can simply vanish. One man, upon returning home, smashed a piece of equipment with an axe, scattering its parts across his garden. The paranoia was real. If a person can be so two-faced with his colleagues, couldn't he be two-faced in other, more significant ways? Even if your source was the director of the CIA himself, and he handed you a piece of paper listing every agent in your country, it doesn't mean you can simply go and round them all up the next day. The damage from these events was more emotional than anything the KGB could inflict. Let's go to Chicago. In the year 1962, FBI agents burst into a hotel room occupied by a 55-year-old woman. They got straight to the point, telling her they knew everything about her work for Soviet intelligence. They used her Moscow-assigned code name, Macy, and offered her a choice: become a double agent. "You're a Russian operative," they said, "but there's a way out. You can work for another intelligence agency under a new name." The woman, whose real name was Maria Dobrava, was a captain in the GRU, the Soviet Union's main military intelligence directorate. She had been living undercover in America for 8 years. She calmly asked the FBI agents for a few minutes to think, requesting they leave her alone in the room. When they stepped outside, she walked onto the balcony and made a final, desperate leap from the 4th floor. It was a conscious choice, a way to ensure she would never betray her country. Back in Moscow, Macy's true fate remained a mystery for a long time. The connection with her simply went dead. And this wasn't an isolated incident for Soviet military intelligence in the United States. In the early 1960s, their operations were failing one after another. Between 1962 and 1963, the Americans arrested several GRU agents within their own special services and military departments. One of them, a U.S. National Security Agency staff sergeant named David Dump, made the same choice as Maria Dobrava. He refused to be taken alive. When an FBI team broke into his home, he ended his own life. These events caused extreme concern in Moscow. It was painfully clear that someone on the inside was feeding information to the Americans, exposing Soviet operatives and their sources. But who was it? The search for this mole, or krot, as they're called in the jargon of the special services, would stretch on for more than 20 years. Fast forward to Moscow, 1980. A GRU general named Leonid Gulyev was reviewing American press publications about intelligence activities. Suddenly, a strange detail in a Reader's Digest article caught his eye. The piece was an excerpt from a forthcoming book about Soviet agents in the US. It told the story of an undercover operative named Carlo Tuomi, who had been arrested in America in 1963. What was strange was that the article's author mentioned the name of the GRU officer who had trained Tuomi and supervised his work in the US over 30 times. But when the full book was published 4 years later, that officer's name had completely vanished. It was as if someone had realized the mistake and ordered a complete scrub of any reference to the man who could have led the Americans to their agent. But there was more. General Gulyev noticed the article included a photograph of the operative, one the Americans should not have had access to. It was a picture from Carlo Tuomi's top-secret personnel file in Moscow. How could it possibly have ended up in an American magazine? The only people with access were those who prepared him for his mission, including that very same officer whose name had been erased from the book. These oddities were too significant to ignore. Soon, the KGB's military counterintelligence unit joined the investigation. They requested all of the GRU's files on the officer, including his personal record. This was the beginning of the operation to unmask the man they codenamed the Cunning Fox. The Cunning Fox was Major General Dmitry Polyakov, at that time the GRU's top man in India. Dmitry Fyodorovich Polyakov was born in 1921. He was a decorated veteran of the Second World War. From 1947 onward, he was an officer of the main intelligence directorate. Over the years, he served as a high-ranking GRU officer in the United States, Burma, and India. In 1974, he was promoted to Major General. He had earned combat medals during the war, serving in the artillery from the very beginning. He was known for his bravery, once taking out 60 enemy combatants in a single battle. He was later transferred to a reconnaissance battalion where he excelled. He was intelligent, perceptive, and an incredibly hard worker. There was no concrete proof against Polyakov, but the GRU leadership decided to take precautions anyway. After his vacation in 1980, they didn't allow him to return to his post in India. He was told to undergo a medical examination. The commission then declared that, due to several chronic health conditions, the respected general could no longer serve in countries with hot climates. It was simply too dangerous for his health. The 59-year-old Polyakov was transferred to a position at an academic institute, effectively cutting him off from all secret information. Meanwhile, the KGB began to meticulously analyze his entire career, and they found plenty of strange patterns. First, shortly after he left the United States in 1962, 10 undercover agents and 5 valuable GRU sources in the country were arrested. In the mid-1970s, the FBI arrested 6 American military personnel who had been supplying valuable information to the GRU. Polyakov knew every single one of them. Second, the KGB's own chief in India, Leonid Shabarshin, had already reported on Polyakov's unusual behavior in the 70s. In meetings, Polyakov would act like a close friend, praising Shabarshin's officers. But later, Shabarshin would hear from reliable sources that in other conversations, Polyakov would relentlessly criticize those same colleagues. If a man could be so duplicitous here, with them, perhaps he was duplicitous in other ways. At the same time, Polyakov often showed an intense and persistent interest in the sources of his KGB colleagues. Why did he need to know? And finally, one more strange detail. The information Polyakov gathered during his foreign assignments was always highly valued by Moscow. But here too, a curious pattern emerged. Polyakov would acquire excellent sources from foreign nationals and send useful information back to the center. But as soon as he left the country, those sources would practically disappear. This was the first major signal that perhaps Polyakov was engaged in deception, making himself look good while his networks were hollow. An operational group from the KGB flew to India. They secretly searched the general's office, his apartment, and the luggage the cunning fox had packed for shipment back to the USSR. Inside his luggage, they found a small bottle with 5 pills. They were immediately sent to Moscow for analysis. Under the guise of ordinary medicine, the bottle could have contained a fast-acting poison, or perhaps a substance for developing secret writing on spy messages. But the lab results came back with a surprise. The pills were nothing more than a simple pain reliever. A covert search of his country house and his Moscow apartment also turned up nothing. Surveillance of Polyakov revealed no suspicious contacts. In other words, there was still no hard evidence proving he was working for American intelligence. On top of all that, the highest levels of the KGB leadership were skeptical. The first deputy chairman of the KGB, Georgy Tsinev, reportedly said something to the effect of, "I doubt that a general, a war veteran who shed his blood for the motherland and has combat awards, would commit such a betrayal." The conclusion was that it had to be a mistake. The investigation had taken a wrong turn, but if it wasn't Polyakov, then who was it that dismantled the GRU's network in the early 1960s? Let's go back to New York, November 16, 1961. At a diplomatic reception, a Soviet military diplomat approached the head of the American mission to the UN's Military Staff Committee. Lowering his voice, he asked, "Could you arrange a meeting for me with someone from American intelligence?" The American replied, "Someone will approach you in an hour." And they did. The FBI gave him the operational code name Top Hat, a name chosen for its symbolism. In those days, diplomats often wore a kind of uniform black tailcoats and top hats. The top hat was a symbol of high social standing, and this new agent seemed like a very important person to the Americans. He quickly proved them right. At his very first meeting with the FBI, Top Hat named the GRU and KGB cryptographers in the Soviet embassy. Then he identified several military intelligence informants in the US and their handlers. And finally, he revealed the identities of Soviet undercover agents operating in the United States, including Macy, Captain Maria Dobrava. Preparing a single one of these illegal agents requires years and years of painstaking work from instructors, document forgers, and the agents themselves. It cost millions upon millions of rubles, and the human cost, the lives of his own compatriots that he ruined, was immeasurable. The FBI began their operation after the spy had already returned to Moscow. There, communication with Top Hat was handed over to the Central Intelligence Agency, which gave him a new code name, Bourbon. While one meaning of Bourbon can be a coarse and ignorant person, that definition certainly did not fit this American spy. He was intelligent and educated, a devoted family man, and moderate in his spending. And this is where the story takes a turn, revealing a motive far more powerful than money. The Americans offered him large sums for the secret information he provided, but he consistently refused. He would only accept small payments, never more than 1 month's salary, to avoid raising suspicion among his colleagues. Decades later, intelligence analysts would uncover a deep personal tragedy in Polyakov's life. His firstborn son had developed a rare, serious illness. Polyakov pleaded with the Soviet authorities for permission to take his son to a New York hospital for specialized treatment that was unavailable in the USSR. The request was denied. His son passed away shortly after. This devastating loss is now widely believed to be the event that shattered his loyalty to the Soviet system, planting a seed of cold, calculated revenge. Bourbon was an experienced and well-trained intelligence officer. He worked with the Americans on unprecedented terms. He himself determined when to make contact and when to go into sleeper mode to avoid detection by Soviet counterintelligence. He chose the locations and methods for passing information. Bourbon even personally crafted the containers for the microfilm he would leave in secret drop spots every 3 months or so. He would take the carefully packaged film and place it inside a piece of modeling clay, which he then rolled in brick dust. The result was a small, unremarkable stone that would attract no attention. And for receiving signals back, it was his idea to use the New York Times newspaper. By spotting a classified ad addressed to, for example, a Donald F., he knew his information had been safely received by the CIA. "The greater the danger, the more interesting my life became," he would later recall. "I got used to walking on a razor's edge and couldn't imagine any other life." But who exactly was Bourbon? Moscow, 1982. The active investigation of Major General Dmitry Polyakov was assigned to a KGB lieutenant colonel named Nikolai Mikhailyukov. The case file he inherited was already voluminous, with the investigation having been underway since 1980. But it was stalled, frozen by a lack of proof and disbelief from the top. For years, Polyakov lived a quiet life, working at his academic institute, seemingly retired from the world of secrets. The cunning fox had gone to ground. The case went cold for nearly 3 years. Then, in 1985, the break came from the most unexpected direction imaginable: the CIA itself. An American CIA officer named Aldrich Ames, who was secretly working as a mole for the KGB, began passing information to his Soviet handlers. In one of his disclosures, he provided a list of assets the CIA was running inside the Soviet Union. On that list were 2 names, Top Hat and Bourbon, and he confirmed they were one and the same man, General Dmitry Polyakov. The ultimate irony of the Cold War. The mole hunt that had lasted over 2 decades was finally ended by a mole from the other side. The net began to close. Polyakov was placed under constant, discreet surveillance. In 1986, he was lured into a meeting under a pretext and finally taken into custody. His final punishment was carried out in 1988. For 25 years, Dmitry Polyakov, the decorated war hero, the brilliant general, the diamond in the crown, had lived a perfect double life. He handed over volumes of critical information, including the names of at least 19 Soviet agents, over 150 foreign contacts, and vast amounts of technical and strategic military documents. He wasn't driven by money or blackmailed into submission. His betrayal seems to have been born from a father's grief and a deep personal vendetta against the very system he had sworn to protect. His story is a chilling reminder of the intricate, hidden games played in the shadows of history. And it makes you wonder about the deeply personal reasons that can drive a person to walk on a razor's edge, risking everything for a secret they carry alone. What if a nation's most decorated military hero was secretly its most devastating enemy? For over a quarter of a century, a high-ranking Soviet general, a man entrusted with the motherland's most sensitive information, was living an elaborate lie. He wasn't just a general in the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. He was the CIA's ultimate asset, an agent so valuable they codenamed him Bourbon. He delivered secrets that altered the very course of the Cold War, yet he asked for almost no money in return. He seemed to be driven by something deeper, a ghost from his past that haunted his every move. To his colleagues, he was a war hero. to his family, a doting father and grandfather. But in the quiet solitude of his home, he would whisper to himself, begging for his sins to be lifted from his shoulders. This is the story of how the KGB's own creeping paranoia, an observant son, and a single act of betrayal on the other side of the world finally exposed the most damaging double agent in Soviet history. The final chapter of this long and dangerous game was about to begin, and no one knew how it would end. The case file on the general was massive, filled with information from every available source. Dmitry Polyakov himself couldn't have missed the signs. He had to know that his sudden recall from India wasn't just about his health. Being an intelligent man, he understood he was now, in the parlance of the trade, under the cap, a target of intense surveillance by the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The agents of the outdoor surveillance unit noted his behavior. Walking down the street, Polyakov would constantly check for a tail, using every trick in the book. He moved all important conversations, even with his own family, outside the apartment. If forced to speak indoors, he'd turn on radios and appliances, cranking the volume to defeat any listening devices. But what did this truly prove? After decades in the intelligence world, this could have simply been the ingrained habits of a professional. One day, a curious incident occurred. Polyakov's son came to visit him at their dacha, their country house. "Something doesn't feel right," the son said to his father. "There's an ambulance parked not far from our house." The general brushed it off. "It's probably here for someone." But his son persisted. "You know, there's another ambulance just down the road. We can barely get one to show up out here, and suddenly there are two? Something about this is making me uneasy." Still, the general made no suspicious moves. The only oddity was what happened when he was alone. He would sigh deeply, and the listening devices would pick up his whispers, "Lord, forgive my transgressions," or "On whom can I lay my sins?" But what exactly was he so guilty of? What secret was tormenting him so? A few months after returning to Moscow, the man the CIA called the jewel in the crown retired. He settled into the quiet, respectable life of a veteran. He spent most of his time at the dacha, pursuing his passions for hunting and fishing, even writing articles for magazines on these subjects. He also loved woodworking, creating intricate items by hand. The special lathes and tools for his hobby had been brought back from his trips abroad. By all accounts, he was happily married, with one son following him into intelligence and another working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But his colleagues knew something else, a dark chapter in the family's history. In 1959, his newborn son had become gravely ill. Despite every effort to save the boy, the medical technology of the time was not enough. The child passed away. Perhaps this was the tragedy that haunted him decades later. But was it the sin he so desperately wanted to lay on someone else? For several more years, the counterintelligence officers could only guess. The answer would come from an unexpected place. Washington, D.C., April 1985. A man approached the guard at the Soviet embassy, handed him a letter, and quickly walked away. On the envelope, just 2 words to the KGB resident. Inside, the author, a CIA employee, offered to provide Soviet intelligence with information on American agents inside their ranks. His price, $50,000. The 1980s were the final, frantic phase of the clandestine war between the CIA and the KGB. The Soviets had taken heavy blows, but they were landing some of their own. Their man in Washington, Viktor Cherkashin, was a brilliant operative, and he had just acquired a source who would change everything. Aldrich Ames. Ames, given the operational pseudonym Lyudmila, would become as valuable to the KGB as Polyakov was to the CIA. From the American perspective, Aldrich Ames was a greedy, loathsome traitor. The end. But if you asked his KGB handler, Viktor Cherkashin, you'd get a very different answer. To the KGB, the agent who comes to you is a hero. The revelations from Ames sent shockwaves through the CIA. As one insider later put it, the agency nearly went off the rails. The emotional damage was immense. In May and June of 1985, Ames handed Colonel Cherkashin information on several American moles inside the GRU and KGB. One of them was an agent codenamed Top Hat. Ames didn't know his real name, but he provided a description. It fit about 20 different GRU officers. The KGB's counterintelligence team went to work, painstakingly narrowing the circle of suspects down to just 5. And then, more specific intelligence arrived from Ames. The new data was so precise, so concrete, that when they laid it over Dmitry Fyodorovich Polyakov's file, it was a perfect match. The foreign assignments to 5 specific countries, the timeline, the access, everything fit. The KGB now had only one suspect, but a perfect fit wasn't proof. They had to consider a more complex game. Could the Americans be sacrificing Polyakov to discredit the entire leadership of the GRU? Was the real target not Polyakov himself, but his powerful boss, General Ivashutin? By exposing Polyakov, they could trigger a purge and remove Ivashutin from his post. This theory had its supporters, and it caused months of doubt and hesitation. The final decision was made. They would take Polyakov in July of 1986, and they wouldn't do it for espionage. The plan was a masterful piece of deception. General Polyakov was invited to give a lecture to students at the Military Diplomatic Academy. This was designed to soothe any fears he had. If they were inviting him to train the next generation of military intelligence officers, surely they didn't suspect him of anything. An ambush was set up at the entrance, to be carried out by the KGB's most elite Special Forces unit, Group A. The commander of the unit was given a final instruction: be careful with him. He's a general after all. Don't rough him up too much. At around 9 in the morning, Polyakov walked into the academy building and gave his name to the duty officer. That was the signal. The operation took mere moments. One officer from the takedown team firmly gripped Polyakov by the neck and chin, preventing him from reaching any poison capsule that might be hidden in his collar. At the same time, others were stripping off his uniform and dressing him in a prearranged tracksuit and sneakers with the laces removed. His reaction was the most damning evidence of all. If he were innocent, there would have been outrage, confusion, a protest. But there was nothing. Polyakov was completely subdued, in a state of shock. He asked no questions. He offered no resistance. It was clear to everyone present that he knew exactly why this was happening. Initially, Polyakov was accused of smuggling weapons. The military counterintelligence officers had found evidence that he had illegally brought a 9-shot revolver into the Soviet Union from Burma and was keeping a Browning rifle at his home. In reality, the weapons were just a pretext. The real plan was to bring him in for questioning, exploit his disorientation, and get an immediate confession for his work with the CIA. They took the general to the infamous Lefortovo prison and brought out the heaviest artillery they had. The first man to enter the interrogation room was the chairman of the KGB himself. The very presence of a figure like Chebrikov was usually enough to make a person enter a state of stupor. It sent a clear message: the case is so serious that it's better not to lie. It's better to tell the truth, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be forgiven. But this time, the effect failed. Polyakov looked the KGB chief in the eye. "I am a combat general," he declared. "I do not recognize any of your accusations. It is all a lie. I have not cooperated with any foreign intelligence service. I have nothing more to say to you." It was a moment of crisis. For the KGB, it seemed the worst-case scenario was unfolding. But then, events took another rapid, unexpected turn. After the KGB chairman left Lefortovo, a regular investigator walked into the room where Polyakov was sitting. He was preparing himself for a long, difficult psychological battle. To his astonishment, the man he faced was no longer the defiant general who had just stared down the most powerful man in the state security apparatus. Polyakov had crumpled. He understood the game was over. "Yes, of course," he told the investigator. "I will tell you everything." He knew he had lost, but why the sudden dramatic change in his behavior? Was it possible that this master spy, this powerful personality, had just started playing a new, more subtle game? That was a puzzle the investigators still had to solve. For now, Polyakov began to talk, explaining how and why he started working for the United States. His first contact with the Americans, he confirmed, took place in New York City on November 16, 1961, and it was on his own initiative. But why? The investigators believed the first push was the illness of his son. The death of the child was the initial shock, and then political motives came later. According to a version of the story popularized in American spy novels, Polyakov had begged his superiors for funds to get his son a life-saving operation in the US, but was refused. Yet in all the official records and personal conversations, Polyakov never once mentioned this as the reason for his betrayal. He explained his actions differently. "My faith in the justice and democracy of the socialist society was shaken," he stated. "I was disgusted by Khrushchev's ravings, his antics, his lack of culture. He was especially angered by the massive cuts to the army under Khrushchev, which threw countless decorated officers out of work. He felt he had to fight against a man like Khrushchev, but Khrushchev was removed from power in 1964. Polyakov was arrested in 1986. Could anyone truly believe he was an ideological warrior for over 20 years? The truth was far more calculated. Polyakov did, in fact, take almost no money from the Americans. But he did not refuse gifts, which the CIA acquired at his request not for himself, but for others. He gave out countless souvenirs and valuable presents to his superiors, the very men who decided his promotions, and most importantly, his assignments to foreign posts. The criminal case file is filled with photos of these offerings, jewelry, ornate silver dining sets, and other valuables. These were the bribes that greased his path upwards, giving him ever greater access to secrets. The CIA did buy some things for him personally, though. They supplied his beloved woodworking workshop with the finest tools, sending him everything from high-quality hammers to the best nails. He was far more cautious with actual spy equipment. Anything that could compromise him was destroyed. In July of 1972, he received an invitation to an official reception at the US Embassy in Moscow. There, a diplomat approached him and, in a handshake, passed him a miniature device for creating microdots. Polyakov was furious at such a brazen and risky move. When he got home, he took an axe to the device, smashing it to pieces and scattering them across his dacha's property. He was eventually supplied with the most advanced tools of the trade, like a chemical for developing secret writing that was cleverly disguised as ordinary pills. The KGB counterintelligence actually found these pills during a search of his luggage in India, but they couldn't figure out the secret. The active chemical was in the core of the pill, But the lab technicians only took samples from the harmless outer shell. It was a frustrating mistake that cost them the physical evidence they needed. His communication sessions with the CIA in Moscow during the 1970s reached a technical level unheard of at the time. Polyakov was given a special device, a true miracle of technology for its day. On it, he could type and encrypt a text message. Then, with the press of a single button, the entire encrypted message would be transmitted into the ether in a fraction of a second. This made it nearly impossible to detect or intercept. The device had only one flaw: its range was no more than 100 meters. This meant that to send his signals, Polyakov had to drive his car and park dangerously close to the US Embassy, a high-risk maneuver he performed time and again. For 25 years, Dmitry Polyakov walked a tightrope, a decorated general by day and a secret agent by night. His downfall was a story of interconnected betrayals, a chain reaction started by another man's greed thousands of miles away. His motives remain a subject of debate to this day. Was he a grieving father who felt his country had failed him? An idealist disgusted by the political system he served? Or a cold, ambitious operator who used ideology as a cover for his climb to the top? Perhaps the answer is a combination of all three. What is certain is that the story of Agent Bourbon serves as a stark reminder of the deeply personal and human dramas that played out in the shadows of the Cold War, where the lines between hero and traitor are drawn by those who win the final game. What do you think truly drove him to do it? Let us know in the comments below.